County Historical Society and the DAR, Daughters of the American Revolution, welcome you here. Please help yourself to the refreshments out in the foyer. We are so excited to hear about Dymond City, so I am going to introduce you to Sarah Hodges Stalls and let her begin.
All right, thank you, Ms. James. Thank you all so much. This is a wonderful crowd. I want to thank a couple of people before I get started. And for, of course, the Historical Society for inviting me back. I was here about a year or so ago to talk about Farm Life School, another one of my favorite things. And I appreciate the chance. I'm a big believer history needs to be appreciated, respected, and shared, and I'm excited to have a chance to do some of that. I also want to thank a couple of people that without them, this would not be possible, and that one is the late Francis Manning. Without Mr. Manning's work, without the way he chronicled the history of Martin County, without him, we would have tremendous gaps in our history. And I am tremendously grateful for all his work. I'm a big reader of everything he ever wrote that I can get my hands on. Two other ladies I'd like to thank, a couple more Mannings. Mary Jo Manning Thompson and her sister Linda Manning Taylor from Farm Life. Around the time of the bicentennial, they put together a history of farm life, and that included in that was a history of Dymond City. So without these other folks who have done all this work, I wouldn't have things to sit here and talk to you about today. So I am very grateful for them. It's hard to think that something that lasted such a short time had such an impact, but it really did. And today we want to cover quickly the railroad, the town, a little bit about the people, and religion and education. These were all things, and how many of you have ever been up to Dymond City? If you go up there now, you're thinking, it was where? Yeah, we rode up there yesterday, and I know that place fairly well, but it's so hard to think back. It's kind of fun for me, because I'm a history lover and a writer, to think about what it was like. And so we're going to touch on these things today. In a correspondence I found between Mr. Francis Manning and H. Temple Crittenden, who was a railroad historian. This was written to Mr. Manning in 1966. He said, you know, that blasted railroad out of Janesville is literally a myth. It was there, yes, but by heck, no one knows the first thing about it. Well, actually we do, thanks to Mr. Manning, among other people. But I love that quote. If you look from the outside and don't know the history of this, it is mind-blowing. And it is a little bit to me. This is a map from 1894. Just to give you a little bit of an idea, does everyone know about where Dymond City is? Come up 171 from Washington, and it's right before the Farm Life School. So it's southern Martin County. You can, in places, you could probably throw a rock and be in Beaufort County. And so this was from 1894. Starting back to where this all got going, we're looking at just post-Civil War Eastern North Carolina. Around 1868, there's the first 67, 68 is when this idea starts coming up. A group of businessmen from up north decided, hey, there's lots of timber. There's lots of unclaimed everything. We need to get in on this. So a gentleman that we're going to talk about in a minute by the name of Francis Lightfoot and a group of other businessmen developed this plan to come down and set up a town. Now, when we talk about the town of Dymond City, we need to talk about it basically as the same thing as the railroad, because they were pretty much the same, and one happened because of the other. And the Tarboro Southerner, which was one of the premier papers in eastern North Carolina back at this time, wrote, for the past 2 years, Lightfoot has been preparing for the settlement of a first-class town. The town was not initially called Dymond City, but soon would be. And it was simply a utility town for the railroad. But it evolved into quite a bit more, or at least it tried to. The Janesville and Washington Railroad and Lumber Company. This is all one thing. The railroad, lumber company, and the town evolved together. There's a lot of trials in this story. There's a lot of mishaps. There's some bad business, some questionable decisions. There's a little bit of everything. A fictional writer could not write this as it happened. Charter was granted for this company in 1869 by our General Assembly. And these are the gentlemen, the list you see here was how it was listed on the original charter. The first president was Henry King, who was with Francis Lightfoot, one of the first two to show interest in our area, or in this part of the area. The two names you see in gold, Richard Waring and Francis Lightfoot, we're going to hear more about. You don't hear a whole lot about the other men in the story after a while. The purpose is straight out of the charter here. For purchasing, holding, and improving lands in Beaufort, Martin, and adjoining counties, and to obtain, to get what was there, to take away what was there. That was the timber. To cut, manufacture, and ship the same to market, to erect houses or other buildings or works as it pertains to the business. It allowed them to set up a town, and it allowed them to cut and ship timber. And that's what the original charter was. And also, they shall have the power to construct such a railroad from the town of Janesville to their lands and to the town of Washington and other points as they may need. At that time, we're talking about total 20-ish miles, 22 miles, as you see it's the different numbers. This is an actual picture of one of the engines. It's a bad picture, but we were talking a long time ago. It was initially a wood tramway. And the difference in a railroad track and a tram, the tramway tracks are laid at ground level. The train tracks are above ground. And early on it was wooden. It was usual gauge or standard gauge, 4 feet, 8.5 inches from inside rail to inside rail. And the ties were mostly heart pine, which had accessible pretty well, pretty good supply available. The company had a sawmill at Deep Run, which was near about 5 miles from the river, and it was on the railway. Another at Waring, which was the original name of Dymond City. So Richard Waring, who we saw earlier, became president of the company, and his name was what was on the town at first. Did not stay there that long. The timber we're looking at, it was between 15 and 20,000 acres of yellow pine, 10 to 15,000 acres of cypress, and 4 to 8,000 of Atlantic white cedar. I did not, growing up, knowing what Atlantic white cedar was. I knew what juniper was, and that's what I was accustomed to calling it. Talk about a few of the people. Mr. Waring, as we said, was a one-time president. He and Henry King became interested in what was known as the John Gray Blunt pattern. That is the area of what we know as Dymond City. And it was close to 40,000 acres of all the timber we just talked about. Waring was also the man who brought another name into the story we'll visit in a minute by the name of Abram Fisher. As someone who's enjoyed writing my whole life, I could not write the story of Abram Fisher and it be nearly as good as what actually happened. So that was, Mr. Waring is in the story early on. He does not stay with the story very long. One of the most beloved names in all of my years of hearing about this and researching it in the story, one of the most beloved people was Captain Bissell. Captain Bissell was born in Birmingham, England, and he comes to Martin County as a young man in his 20s. He came as the chief engineer for the railroad. He was handpicked. Reading in this, it blows my mind that at this time period, people are coming from all over the world. I still cannot think cultural melting pot and Dymond City at the same time. But that's what it was. It is amazing. Captain Bissell made his home there. And later on, he would become the railroad superintendent. He even leased it himself at one time. He married a young lady from Edenton by the name of Sarah Ellis. And they had 2 children, Beatrice, or Bernie, and Matthew. I've known the name Matt Bissell my entire life because he was one of the 2 last surviving residents of the town. They made Dymond City their home, and they moved into the hotel eventually. Bertie, or Beatrice, married into the Daniel family, which we have one of her direct descendants here this afternoon. And she stuck around. Later, Captain Bissell operated a railroad and leased it himself, and they were the last to leave town. His family moved down to Janesville, and he decided to take on farming, and was there until he passed away. By all accounts, he was such a beloved person, just a genuinely good man that people were drawn to. And at this time of uncertainty and things, I'm sure that went a long way. Thanks to the Daniel family collection, this is Matt Bissell and his sister. Beatrice was born in 1882 and Matt in 1885. They were truly children of Dymond City, from all we can tell. And the Bissell family, most of them are buried at the doorstep of Dymond City now. Matt died in 57. He was one of the last two to call it home. The other one was Miss Connie Boehner. I did not have the privilege of knowing Miss Connie, but I feel like I do because I heard stories surrounding her my whole life. She was in where, if you've been up to Dymond City, where the trailer is up there now, that's where the Boehner place was. And actually, my husband was probably one of the last people to see that house up right before it burned, because he was up there spotlighting deer one night and saw the glow of the fire starting when we lost that house sometime probably in the 80s. Miss Connie never married, neither did Matt. And in their older years, I thought they were a couple, because they were all, you always heard one spoke of together, but Miss Duck Hardison confirmed for me, they just put up with each other. They just looked after each other in their old age. But Miss Connie was known for being tough. And she was born right in that time of Dymond City. My dad told me a great story one time. He was a teenager before he was old enough to actually legally drive. Took the car and went and picked up Miss Connie for church at Piney Grove. And she hollers for him, "John, Manny, come back here." She has a ball of rattlesnakes under the barn. And there she is with 2 shovels trying to kill them. They were a little late for church that day. I would have been under the bed in the house waiting until they left, but she was tough. And it sounds like she grew up in a time where she knew nothing else. We were noticing the emblem on her gravestone. It's a hammer and an anvil. And I think that may pay tribute back to her family being blacksmiths and wheelwrights. They came over, the Boehners came over from Beaufort County, which in places you throw a rock, you're in Beaufort County. And her grandmother was of the Getzinger family, which is a whole nother afternoon story in itself right there. But she and Matt and Miss Connie were the last 2 there. They were lifelong, they're children of Dymond City, lifelong residents. Francis Lightfoot, who we saw earlier, was a general surveyor for the company. And that map to the right here, the big map, is a Francis Lightfoot map of Dymond City that you can take a look when we're done. He had an amazing task. We're looking at almost 40,000 acres. And he came in there and tried to make sense of it on paper. Numbers are not my thing. My husband is a surveyor. Does this even blow your mind?
Yeah.
Mr. Lightfoot may have been the richest man on paper to call the area home. Again, we're talking 1870 census, personal property on the census record of $70,000. So the man had money, he was on a mission. Now looking at the town, 1870 population records say it was 90 people. Previously called Waring, it was renamed, that date, there's not a concrete date that I can find, early 1870s. It became Dymond City, and it is most likely for J.J. Dymond, a British stockholder, who had probably quite a bit of money sunk into this. Because as we all know, if you go to a basketball game or a football game, if there's a name on the arena or the field, somebody paid for it. So there were 2 sections to Dymond City. There was Dymond City, which was predominantly the white section, and there was a Negro or colored section called Jacktown. This was the far eastern part. But there was there were sections, but there was a lot of joint operation within this town. And so at a time where it might not have been the norm. Picture it, if you will, a 32-room hotel in Dymond City. I still struggle picturing a tobacco barn up there. A 32-room hotel, visitors from England, Ireland, the northern U.S., all over the place, to Dymond City. One of my favorite things that came out of Linda and Mary Jo's work, they talked to my great aunt, Miss Dorcas Robertson. And some of you may remember the name Nathan Robertson, who was a deputy here for a long time. This was his mother. Aunt Dorcas was a child at this time, and she said, "Baby, she remembered the hotel." She said, going to the hotel and kind of looking under their doors, it was like looking at Miss Kitty's from Gunsmoke, was how she described it. And I used to love sitting there. My memories of it are very vague, but I used to love sitting there. I'd soak up anything. Her stories, I could listen to her all afternoon. The hotel was later the residence of the Bissell family, but it burned like so many things did in that area. There's different dates, but between 1927 and 1930, it looks like whatever was left was lost to fire. I don't know if it was 2 different waves of fires. I'm still not sure about that. There was a house across the street from the hotel. Is where the owners lived. This is the actual 3-story building that was in the town. This building served several purposes. The first floor was the general store and post office. Now this served as the post office hub for the whole area. And there's a lot of names you don't hear anymore that were served by this. Grundy, Deep Run you'll still hear a little bit. Amherst, another part of farm life now. This was the hub for all the surrounding postal space. Second floor was the residence, and third floor, there's some debate. Some people said it was the home of the Friends or the Quakers, which we're going to talk about in a minute. Dymond City was the hub of the Quaker religion in Martin County. Other people say that was my granddad, we never met there. So it's like anything, it just depends on what you read. Had a railroad shop where they could house 2 or 3 cars. There was a blacksmith shop, sawmill, and a flour and grist mill, all as a part of the Dymond City. They're pretty self-sufficient, which I guess at that point you needed to be. Jacktown, there was a Methodist church. Mr. Ed Lowe oversaw that church, and there was a colored school district 24. That was in operation from 85 to 93. And there are numbers available of how many students were served. It was a pretty strong school attendance area at that time. There was not a white school district close enough for the students there to go to. There was the Hardison's Mill District, which in modern day terms, the end of Maple Grove Road, out by Mr. Raymond Gherkin's old store. That was Hardison's Mill School District area. But it was too far to go. You couldn't make that trip realistically. So a gentleman that we're going to meet in just a second, his daughter taught at the home that he built for his family. And luckily she was paid by the school board. There are records you can actually still see now. But she taught in the home. So that gentleman is Mr. Abram Fisher. You'll see Abraham and you'll see Abram. It's documented both ways. I went with what I'm accustomed to having heard. Mr. Fisher, I hate to use the term character, but again, as someone who loves literature, you couldn't write this stuff. And it'd be any more intriguing than it already was. He was a native of Cork County, Ireland, and he was selected by Mr. Waring to come. Things didn't go well early on for Dymond City. Bleeding money. They were paying exorbitant amounts for labor that they could not uphold. These guys were supposedly businessmen, but on paper it doesn't look like they had a real good handle on that. At least not for where they were. He's selected by Waring to come and help complete the railroad line. The railroad is still not done. It's barely started. And that was the whole point of this. Somewhere between 1872 and 75, again, it depends on what you read, Mr. Fisher makes it to Martin County from the Argentinian Republic. He is managing a farm in Argentina. 7 children at least, and his wife. That trip alone would be its own movie. I would honestly love to see that. To give you some idea of what we're talking, your 2 red arrows. This is close to 7,000 nautical miles. 1800s, there was nothing easy about this trip at all. They did go up to Pennsylvania and stay with some family when they got back to the States, and then work their way back down to Dymond City. But they've been working a farm colony. He's been managing that in Argentina. That didn't go so good. You can debate, well, if he was already struggling there, why did they tap him for this operation? No one knows. We'll never know. So they make this monumental trip back and bring back a few friends with them. Now, when he gets back, the stakeholders in Pennsylvania are so impressed with Mr. Fisher, they send him over to England to try to make things good with the bondholders. He did such a great job doing that, they gave him the job of managing the railroad. Little catch there, though, there was no pay. He could keep the profits from the sawmill was the agreement. We don't know if the sawmill was making any profits, but he kept it at that point. So he had a couple of jobs ahead of him. And they said, if possible, extend the railroad on to Washington. So this man comes in, he's got a lot on him, not to mention 7 kids, and he treated everything, I can't even begin to imagine this. He's also credited for beginning the shingle industry in Dymond City. Shingles were made, there are legends of where the shingles landed, we don't know for sure. But he did get the shingle industry up and going. So all that timber we looked at that was in the John Grable and Patton, he put it to work. Any questions at this point? He builds a large 2-story home called Majessa. If you go to the T at Dymond City and look down to the left, it was, the best we can tell, that 2.5 miles down that way. This was a huge home. Majessa was the spelling using the letters from all of his daughter's first names, from what I can tell. Sure, makes sense to me, much as anything. And it was the center of Quaker services. Now, I grew up Baptist. Methodist was exotic growing up. Because if it didn't happen between Piney Grove and Maple Grove, I was out of my element already. But he brings the Quakers to this area, the Society of Friends. To say Mr. Fisher was devout is probably an understatement. The home became the center of the Quaker services. And it also became a showpiece on the railroad stop. There's a couple of accounts, one reporter, and that read especially in 1879, writes about the amazing man, his wonderful family, what a showpiece the house is. Very impressed by the stop. So apparently the stop was, if the train stopped, folks got off and kind of got to see the place. Not sure if I'd like to live like that. Every time the train stopped, you were going to have company. I'm not. His devotion to his religion. There are reports, several reports, he would walk to Williamston. 14 miles was the estimate. And take a canoe up to Woodland in Northampton County because there was a Quaker community there. That was not unheard of for him to do. My toes broke on that one because there are some Sunday mornings I struggle to make it around the corner. So that one hit home a little hard for me. But he introduced this area to the Quakers. It was short-lived, but for a time there was another functioning religious community here. Greatest story of all, one of my favorites about Mr. Fisher, he walked into Williamston to do business with an attorney. And Mr. Francis Manning recorded this in his writings. He walked to the attorney's office, realizes he left the paper at home and he walked 14 miles to come address. Says, I'll step right back and fetch that. As far as we know, he walked right back and got it. But he knew nothing else. This was not an easy time. He knew nothing else but surviving tough things. So, by everything I've ever read, this gentleman was just something else. Just as good a person if we could have looked for someone to come into the community. Now, we get to 1880. Populations have hanging around 84. This is 28 white, 56 in Jacktown in the Negro community. Most heads of households were white males born outside the U.S. That melting pot culture was still working. No one was from here. Yeah, and we always can tell when somebody's not from here when they start talking. I can only imagine the dialects that were going on up there at some point. Some of the heads of households were as far from Sweden, Ireland, England, even Canada. Most of the whites were Quakers, and most of the Jacktown community was post-Civil War settlers. That was another community. This was a whole new time for them, and there was probably, I would imagine, a lot of excitement in that community. They were opening businesses. They were self-sufficient, and they were on their own with little to worry about for the first time. It had to be exciting, and equally had to be very disappointing when things started falling apart. 1890, population is hanging around 90. 6 years later, down to 10. The decline, just when it started, it went rampant. By 1900, the post office had been relocated to Amherst in the farm life area but outside of Dymond City. So let's look at the overall timeline, kind of putting it back together. 1869, the charter is approved by the state. First segments of the line were on the ground in 1870. They called it operational in 1877, and again, it was a little over 22 miles. 1883, they have a special act authorizing the company to take up parts of the track and reroute the line. And by 1896, it's over. Service had ended. So what happened? Of course, we weren't there. We can't be completely sure. But it stands to reason by the numbers you see on paper, a reckless management of cutting timber probably played a role in it. Some folks who got in here, they might have been businessmen, but were they timber people? Maybe they weren't both. Not sure. Timber goes, so goes the money. When the timber is stripped too fast, the resources are going, there's nothing to bring in revenue for. This is one theory. Another part that played into this was a lot of people left the area for health reasons. A lot of the Irish and European community that was there was told they had to go back home or go elsewhere because of their health. And several of the big players did go back to Ireland, and most didn't survive very long after they got back. We'll never be completely sure what happened, but I have to believe the timber was a big factor in this. Being a lover of history, there's too many times there's names we don't ever hear that we probably should. When I wrote for the paper and things, I love telling stories that would not get told otherwise. And some of the names I wanted you to hear today are some of the people that might not ever get talked about again. J.D. Hill and Moses Hill, I believe they were family. They were prominent residents of Jacktown. They were blacksmiths and wheelwrights, and both served on the county school board for a number of years. These were, again, men who were finally on their own, doing it, and they thrived. Henry Nolan, he came from Ireland via Argentina with the Fishers. He married the Fishers' oldest daughter, Maria, and lived on the second floor of the store and acted as postmaster. He had to end up going back to Ireland because of his health. His wife stayed here, and she was postmaster until it moved to Amherst around 1900. Henry Fisher. This was Fisher's nephew. He was accountant for the company. and he married a friend of Nolan's named Edith Etchison. She was apparently a pretty amazing piano player and singer. Probably performed at the hotel from what I can tell. And then lived next to it. After the decline started, he took a job with Norfolk and Western Railroad and moved to Norfolk. Charles Grimshaw was the son of one of those stockholders. This is a fascinating part of the story to me. He was loaded. These people did not have a concern about money, but he had an appreciation for working. So he came here, he came with the Fishers, started working at the farm at Majesta, helping tend the farm. He truly enjoyed it and stayed here and married another Fisher daughter, Anna. They worked here, and then they ended up building a place called Charlwood, which was right beside Majesta. So there was still things happening. Elizabeth Fisher Mazel, another Fisher daughter, there was a handful of them. She married a Martin County man named Eugene Mazel, and they ended up going up to Pennsylvania. Eugene's nephew, Eugene Robertson, married the young lady Dorcas that we were talking about earlier. So the ties to Martin County got a little deep there. There is so much more to this story, but knowing that we had to pick a route, I could stay here all afternoon talking about this. I truly could. But this is just to hopefully give you a better understanding of how this got started. We all have heard about the light. And speaking of, Sharon, would you turn this back on? I went looking for the light a few times as a teenager. Never found it though. Got lost. There's no worse feeling than being lost in Dymond City at 2 in the morning, and you don't know what the worst feeling is, trying to explain why you were late when you do get home, or are you going to get home. That's a whole other story. This town was remarkable, and the fact that the timber brought the attention to eastern North Carolina. I've read this, I've known this story my whole life, I've studied, and it still is amazing to me. We don't know what might have been, but at one time the words cosmopolitan were used for Dymond City. You know, and you can't help but get tickled if you've ever been up there. But it just didn't work out. But amazing things happened, and people from all over the world came here for what could have been. On the flip side, I celebrate them because they tried. You know, none of this would have ever happened had they not tried. And it is such an amazing piece of our history. And if you really, how many of you are from Martin County? If you really, really think about it, we've got some amazing history in every corner of this county. I mean, from every part of it. And our story needs to still get told. And that's why I love these opportunities to talk about things like this. No one, you could not convince somebody that knows nothing about this ever happened. And that railroad historian that we talked about early on, he didn't believe it. Better management, it was early in this, we don't know what it might have taken, but it made a true impact on this place. And for people like, I always think that people like Connie Boehner and Matt Bissell, who, that was their whole lives. They were born there. His family came for the railroad, hers came for the work in the town. They spent their entire life there. What I would have given to sit down with those two and hear their stories. I've heard some of them second, third, and fifth hand, but I would do my best. Are there questions that I can try to answer from anyone? Again, I could be up here all afternoon. I mean, I had to go with the Baptist version because we could have stayed all day talking about this.
Did you say who built the hotel?
The town.
The town.
What
about the day for that?
Not sure. Early 1870s.
It's interesting that Fisher was Quaker from Ireland. They're all Catholics.
That story has, so you're exactly right.
His mother must have been a Quaker.
Must have been. Now, when he left this area, he stayed till the bitter end. And when he did leave, he went to the Northampton County area where that Quaker community was. Eventually, we go back to Pennsylvania. But that's a great point. Talking to Catholic community. in Ireland, and here comes this man and this Quaker. We don't know how that happened. That's a great point. Yes, ma'am.
Do you have any information on anything about Octagon soap?
Thank you for bringing that up. Yes,
You're
ma'am.
welcome.
The patent for Octagon soap was made in Dymond City. The initial patent for Octagon soap was developed and patented in Dymond City.
To get all that wood stuff out there.
It was a thing of necessity. Truly, it was a thing of necessity. They said, "Hey, this might sell," and so that was one of the big. Thank you for mentioning that. But that was developed there, and you don't see Octagon soap a whole lot anymore. I remember when I was a kid, the dishwashing liquid was still sold. The big yellow cylinder bottles.
I remember seeing a bar of it. It was a white paper package with a red,
Yes,
and
ma'am.
that's all I remember. I'm old.
Are there any other questions I can try to
Are there
answer?
any pictures of the hotel that you talked about?
I have not found them. The 3-story house was the closest I could find. I will gladly get them to the society and post them if I do come across any. I'm still looking, but I have not ever been able to find one of the hotels.
Did Dymond City have something, hunting industry?
There was,
Northerners that would come down to hunt,
that was informal. I think it was Friends of Friends. And later on, after Dymond City was done with, there was still a hunting lodge up there for some time. But that was just a convenient, empty place at that time before Weyerhaeuser took it all over. Yes, ma'am.
One other thing have you ever heard a story about how people traveling from like Jamesville to Washington, they get on the train, I guess, down at the river somewhere, but it's mostly freight. But if they were traveling, that the first class, I'm going to call it, travelers got to just ride. But if you did not pay you know where I'm going.
I had to get out and gather
Get
wood
out
to help it.
and pick up the wood to fuel the boiler.
I've read that in many places. First class tickets, which I think were about 50 cents at the time, you just got to sit and ride, you were special. But a couple of occasions, even first class had to get out and help. Now this brings up another thing, another part of the downfall of the line. You can look, there's several lawsuits that were filed against the railroad. The affectionate name, the not so affectionate name of the railroad became the Jolt and Wiggle, which said nothing for the comfort of that ride. There was a few lawsuits that might have had something to them. There were a few that were completely laughable. But the financial part of being sued could not have helped things at all.
Could you go into the story of the blight? Get some background information about it.
I don't know what it is. I mean, I don't know what Jeff Oliver
Somebody
said.
lose a life?
There is lore and legend about the source of the light. One I have heard over the years is that there was an accident with a man on the back of a car and another car struck him and he was holding a light to work on something. But again, nothing to base that on. But there's probably more stories about the source of that light.
But that's the one I'd always heard about. I didn't know if it was fact and fiction.
I've never seen it. Do I deny it? No. But can I say I've seen it? No. There are plenty of people who have. Some of my more sane friends say they've seen it. So.
Where would the location of the post office that will move from down the city in Farm Lake, where would that be? What road would that be on that?
Amherst, I'm still trying to nail that down completely. Amherst was more towards the Maple Grove area, but I don't have a definite location for it.
Can I add something to that?
Feel free.
My understanding is, and I think this is pretty accurate, Amherst was the crossroads right where Piney Grove comes into 171, and that little building was actually moved back to Mr. Harrington Farm, and parts of it were left there up until maybe the last 10 years. And I actually have, I have a copy when that William Harrington, well, many of you might know, that lives there in the home place. They found in that building, they found a little receipt of a piece of registered mail that had come to Mr. Will Hardison, who was Mr. Rufus Hardison, if that means anything to y'all's daddy. And the irony of that was, the receipt was where he had ordered some hymn books from a printing company in a place called Chatsworth, Georgia. And my sister lives in Chatsworth, Georgia, so that was a little bit interesting when we found out that. But at some point in time, I made a copy of it. William has the original back, but it was just a few dollars. But it was addressed to Amherst Post Office, and the little building was moved right behind the Harrington home. And my understanding was it set up maybe on the right-hand side, if you were coming from Piney Grove Church back to 171, set right there on the right-hand side. And by the way, at that time, some of the Manning books mentioned there were like 18 post offices in Martin County. So that was back before the consolidation.
Thank you. And see, that's the joy, that's why I love about history, you can continually learn things. But Grundy, Deep Run, Amherst, there's a ton of names that had post offices. And part of that was, you had to have it within walking distance, or traveling distance. So it probably had a lot to do with why there were so many. And of course, mail came by boat for a lot of that. Anything from far away was likely to have come to the river by boat and then dispersed. Yes, sir.
Who owned the timber that was being cut? Had that been purchased by the company, or was it owned by the state or landowners?
The company bought the rights to the timber, is my understanding, from that John Gray Blunt patent. And if anybody knows anything about Washington, that's a family name from Washington. They purchased the rights and everything, the land, everything, is the way I've always understood it. Yes, sir.
The old sawmill that was in Janesville, was that part of this or was that later?
It's part of it,
It was part of it?
form and blade, yes.
That was
I
my,
have heard that that mill made these shingles that supposedly.
No, that was Dennis Simmons.
Monticello, I thought.
well, that's one of those things we can't find, I've heard that too, we can't, I've never been able to find verification. But do I doubt it? Absolutely not. But can I say it for sure? No. But that was a part of their operation. And that's where Fisher was able to make what profits he could make at the mills, that was his. One of the mills burned, and so they ended up with just one very early on.
Yeah, that was during the Civil War.
And where was I've heard, I won't call them rumors, but I've been told where that mill was that sat closest to the river that it was at the Roanoke River termination of the J&W tram. Where,
Right behind River's Edge Restaurant.
that's what I was told.
Thank you.
Because there was two mills there, one of them that was on Astoria that's been talked about a
That's
lot.
Dennis.
That was the, Dennis Simmons, was that the one on Astoria?
Yes, sir.
So that's the one that's talked about a lot, but the other one was down further back, after you pass through Janesville, going through Plymouth, just shortly after you go through the stoplight on the left, is that right?
Well, yeah, it's a sawmill there, that was Gaines and Kirkland. That didn't have anything to do with it, the J&W.
And the
But
second,
I was speaking about on Old 64, right on the river, right where the little clubhouse is. Is that where the J&W ended
Yes,
up there?
right there behind River's Edge Restaurant.
It used to be called, what, Simmons Mill, right? And now
Simmons Mill's on Astoria Road, that's where the new boat ramp.
that's where the boat ramp is.
and the second mill that the J&W people had was closer back to the town.
Yeah, that was Warren.
Sorry?
Warren's sawmill. It was, that's where, it was there at the Dymond City plant.
So,
And then they had one in Washington, there on the, close to the waterfront. It was
So
three
did they
sawmills.
ever go all the way through? Did it make it to Washington?
Yes.
it did make it to
Oh,
Washington.
yes.
There's documentation of a big celebration that happened when they actually made it through. So it did make it the whole way through.
Yes, ma'am. Make one trip a day, according to the information I read.
Any other questions I can try to answer?
Was that all on the wood track, that original?
Originally a wood track, but we believe a lot of that got replaced. We actually have a piece over here you can take a look at. This is what we believe to be a piece of the track.
It is. I got 4 pieces of it.
And so, but we, early on, it said wooden track, so we don't know if the whole thing ever made it wooden, or if the time it got all laid out, they moved to this. So feel free to come take a look. This is, reclaimed, let's just say. It was saved.
Or
It was saved from the elements.
It's a historical property.
It is. Well, any other questions? Yes, Jim?
Any other businesses that you might not have mentioned, that came about in the town? that you-
I mentioned the ones that I'm sure of. There was a couple of other
Trading
restaurants.
post or anything?
Well, the general store served as basically the hub that was at the bottom floor of the 3-story. That was basically the center of the universe there. And with the post office and everything right there. But between that and the hotel, that was their biggest thing. And what I would give to have seen a peek in that hotel like my Aunt Dorcas did. What we have up here, if you'd like to take a look, we're about wrapping up. Craig Daniels was kind enough to bring a sketch that Bailey Phelps had done of J&W. This is the Lightfoot map, a copy of the map that shows the initial breakdown of Dymond City.
And that probably dates 1871. It was part, I believe, of a report, what was it, like about 28 or 30-page report from the company at that time that was describing the area, and this was a part of that report. I think when I basically give information to people who were trying to recruit to come to the area.
Somewhere between a annual report and a recruitment tool. And then we have the piece over here. Well, if nobody else has any other questions, that is what I have for you today. And I'll be around, and thank you all so much. I hope I was able to bring you something that you might not have known before.
Wayne, would you mention the genealogy club that's being formed in the meetings that take place at Big's house?
Well, I wasn't at the first one. Why don't you mention it? You